and welcome to Newsreel Asia's The India Report. I am Asad Ashraf. This week, three stories that look completely unrelated. The government saying your passport may not prove you are a citizen. Two men killed in police encounters 9 days apart in two different states, and alleged cash theft inside the Ram Temple Trust in Ayodhya. Three institutions, one question. What happens when institutions ask us to trust their procedures, but those procedures don't deliver what they're supposed to? Let's begin. Let me start with a very simple question. In fact, it's a question every Indian should be able to answer without even thinking twice. Imagine this. You were born in India, you went to school here, you have worked here all your life, you have paid taxes for decades, you have voted in election after election. The government has issued you an Aadhaar card, a voter ID, and eventually a passport, a document it gives you only after verifying your identity, your address, and your nationality. So the answer should be obvious. You are an Indian citizen, right? Well, this week the Ministry of External Affairs quietly made a statement that in carefully worded legal language suggests that answer is not quite that simple. Here is what the ministry actually said. Citizenship in India is governed by the Constitution and the Citizenship Act of 1955. A passport, on the other hand, is issued under a completely different law, the Passport Act of 1967. In legal terms, a passport simply records the government's satisfaction at the time it was issued that you are entitled to travel as an Indian national. Strictly speaking, they argue it isn't a certificate of citizenship in the same way that, say, a birth certificate or a court order might be. Now, if you read that very narrowly as a technical legal argument, it's not entirely unreasonable. Different law, different purpose, different legal framework. Fair enough. But this is where the argument starts falling apart. Because before that passport ever reaches your hands, the government puts you through an extensive verification process. You cannot ask citizens to go through your own verification machinery, accept their documents, verify their identity, collect their money, issue an official government document, and then later claim that the very document you issued does not really establish what people assumed it established. That's not merely a legal technicality. For ordinary citizens, it becomes a trap. Which brings us to the obvious question. If a passport is not enough, then what is? And the honest answer as of June 2026 is surprisingly, nobody really knows. India still does not have one clear nationwide final list of documents that conclusively establish citizenship. Think back to December 2019. The NRC protests were spreading across the country. People were not asking abstract constitutional questions. They were asking something far more practical. Tell us exactly what documents we need. At the time, the government's own Press Information Bureau said that citizenship could be established through documents relating to a person's date and place of birth. But it also admitted something important. The final list of acceptable documents had not yet been decided. That was more than 6 years ago, and that list still does not exist. The same document that establishes one person's citizenship can be waved away as insufficient for someone else, depending on which official happens to be reviewing the file on that particular day in that particular office. Now here is where things become even more striking. The Aadhaar card, which is probably the one government document most Indians carry with them every single day, has already been ruled out by the Supreme Court as proof of citizenship.
माननीय सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने कहा है कि आधार का उपयोग आधार एक्ट के अनुरूप होगा और आधार एक्ट के सेक्शन 9 में ये कहा गया है कि आधार डोमिसाइल का या सिटीजनशिप का प्रमाण नहीं होगा।
The most widely held government issued identity document in India cannot prove you are a citizen. The Ministry of External Affairs says your passport also cannot by itself prove you are a citizen.
अब एक डॉक्यूमेंट को इसलिए दिया जाता है आपको कि हम भारत के नागरिक हैं, और अगर आप पासपोर्ट एक्ट सेक्शन 6 सबसेक्शन 2 सबसेक्शन ए पढ़ेंगे तो वो ये कह रहा है कि उसको पासपोर्ट नहीं दिया जाएगा जो भारत का नागरिक नहीं है। फिर क्या मतलब इसका?
So what fills the gap? For millions of ordinary Indians, the answer is painfully familiar. Old papers, often handwritten records kept in village offices decades ago, documents that may have been damaged in floods, destroyed in fires. Now, if you are a wealthy professional living in a major city with nearly organized files and perhaps even a family lawyer, this might be frustrating. It may mean a few visits to government offices, some paperwork, a week or two of follow-up. But imagine the same situation if you are a daily wage laborer or an elderly widow whose late husband handed every family document. Suddenly proving something you have never been asked to prove before becomes almost impossible, not because you are any less Indian, but because the system was never really designed with people like you in mind. And we already know what happens when documentary proof becomes the center of citizenship. We have seen it before in Assam. The National Register of Citizens required residents to prove using documentary evidence stretching back across generations that they or their ancestors had been living in India before the 24th of March 1971. When the final NRC list was published, it included 31.1 million names, but it also left out 1.9 million names.
बांग्लादेश से जो घुसपैठी आए हैं उनको बाहर भेजना चाहिए कि नहीं भेजना चाहिए?
They were not automatically declared foreigners. Instead, they entered a legal grey zone, no longer on the citizen list, not formally recognized as foreigners either, just suspended in uncertainty. At one point during the NRC process, more than 2.6 million people's Aadhaar biometrics were logged. Some couldn't access subsidized food. Some couldn't receive welfare benefits. And during the COVID pandemic, reports suggested that some were even denied emergency assistance because their documentation had become uncertain.
हायर एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव लेवल पर क्लेम्स एंड ऑब्जेक्शंस का डिस्पोजल होगा। पहले तो ये मैं क्लैरिफाई करना चाहता हूं। फिर उसके बाद भी कोई संतुष्ट नहीं होता है तो उसके लिए फॉरेनर्स ट्रिब्यूनल में जाने का अवसर रहेगा अध्यक्ष महोदय, और मैं समझता हूं कहीं ना कहीं तो न्याय मिलेगा ही।
Political philosopher Hannah Arendt, writing in The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, after witnessing the destruction of European Jewish life and the rise of statelessness across Europe, Arendt arrived at one of her most influential ideas. Without a state willing to recognize you, protect you, and stand behind you, those rights become incredibly fragile. For Arendt, the most fundamental right was not any individual freedom. It was the right to belong to a political community that acknowledged you as one of its own. The NRC placed nearly 2 million people into legal uncertainty through documentary procedures that many struggled to navigate. The Aadhaar card, the everyday proof of identity carried by 1,300 million Indians, was ruled insufficient. And now comes the Ministry of External Affairs saying that even a passport may not prove to be a citizenship document. Seen individually, each of these developments may appear technical, but together they form a pattern in which the state reserves the ability to question your belonging even after issuing documents that most people naturally assume settle that question. Now let's move to our second story. On the surface, it has nothing to do with passports or citizenship. This story does not begin in a government office. It begins on a dark road at night. It involves two men who died 9 days apart in two different states. Both deaths were described using exactly the same word, encounter. But once you look beyond that single word, the two stories become very different, and together they force us to confront an uncomfortable question: who gets due process and who gets a bullet? Let's start with Muzaffarnagar. A joint police team signaled a Punjab registered car to stop on the Baman Heri Roorkee road. According to the police, the driver refused. Instead, he abandoned the vehicle and opened fire. Two constables were injured. The driver was shot twice, once in the leg and once above the waist. He was taken to the hospital. For a day, it appeared he might survive, but on Tuesday, he died. His name was Satpal. Locally, people knew him as Sattu. Now, here is what the police say about him.
ये जालंधर जेल से भागा हुआ बदमाश था तथा विभिन्न प्रकार के मेरठ, जालंधर, सहारनपुर तथा मुजफ्फरनगर से वांछित चल रहा था तथा अपहरण की गई लड़कियों के साथ दुष्कर्म की घटना जंगलों में तथा विभिन्न प्रकार के होटलों इत्यादि में लगातार ये करता रहता था.
A reward had recently been announced for information leading to his arrest after the alleged kidnapping of a teenage girl on June 19. Now let's believe for a moment that all of this is true, because he was not convicted in any of these cases as of now. If that's the case, Satpal looks exactly like the sort of person people point to when they defend encounter killings, because this is precisely the kind of case where our commitment to due process is tested. The real question is not whether you believe in due process when the person who dies seems sympathetic. The real test is whether you still believe in due process when the person who dies appears, based on everything available, to have committed terrible crimes. In India, people often speak about encounters as though they are a recognized legal category. They are not. There is no separate offense, no separate legal classification called an encounter in Indian criminal law, not under the old Indian Penal Code, not under the Bharatiya Nyaya Sahita. Every encounter must be followed by a mandatory FIR, a mandatory magisterial inquiry, and a mandatory report to the National Human Rights Commission. Every single time, regardless of who was killed, regardless of what they were accused of. But in practice, the word encounter has taken on an entirely different meaning. It's becoming shorthand. The media repeats it almost automatically. The public hears it and often reaches a conclusion before an independent investigation has even begun. Now let me place Satpal's case alongside another encounter that happened just 9 days earlier, because that's where this conversation becomes much more complicated. This time, we are in Bihar's Bhojpur district. The man who died was a 28-year-old Bharat Bhushan Tiwari. He was not a gangster. He was a local social media commentator with more than 160,000 followers on Facebook. On June 15, he uploaded posts that were genuinely alarming. He spoke about starting a revolutionary war. He allegedly issued a direct threat against local magistrate. On June 16, one full day before the fatal encounter, the Bhojpur police publicly described Tiwari as mentally unstable. They announced that they intended to take him into custody for psychiatric treatment, not arrest him, treat him.
प्रशासन अकेले बुलाया कि हाँ आइए यहाँ. अब इसके बाद उनके हाथ में जो अस्त्र था उसको फेंकवाया. अब इसके बाद बेरहमी से यहाँ पे कोई भी संविधान, कोई भी नियम, कोई भी कानून में ऐसा नहीं किया गया किसी को आप शूट कर दीजिए, पैर में गोली मारिए. ये तरीका है ना कि हम वो कोई गुंडा आतंकवादी था, समाज के लिए लड़ रहा था, इसलिए बहुत खराब हो गया, उसको गोली मार दिए. आप बहुत बड़ा वीरता का काम कर दिए.
If the police genuinely believed someone was mentally unwell, why was the response the following day an armed special task force instead of a psychiatric crisis team? A witness present at the scene has publicly stated that Tiwari threw away his weapon before he was shot. If that's true, then the fatal shot came after the immediate threat had already ended. Within days, Bihar Chief Minister Samrat Chaudhary announced a judicial inquiry. 6 police personnel were suspended. Tiwari's mother filed an FIR accusing the officers involved of murder. So, when a government itself suspends its own officers within days and orders a judicial inquiry almost immediately, it suggests something important. Something somewhere inside the system had already raised doubts about the official version. Now, let's zoom out because these are not isolated incidents. According to data released by the Uttar Pradesh police themselves, the state has recorded more than 12,500 encounters since March 2017.
उपलब्ध जो डेटा है उसके मुताबिक एनकाउंटर में कुल 207 अपराधी मारे गए। एनकाउंटर में मारे गए अपराधियों में 67 मुस्लिम थे, 20 ब्राह्मण, 18 ठाकुर, 16 यादव, 8 अन्य ओबीसी और 14 एससी, 3 एसटी और 2 सिख अपराधी शामिल थे।
The government itself published these numbers, not reluctantly, not after a court order. It released them proudly as evidence of effective governance, as something to celebrate. Think about that for a moment again. Self-defense is supposed to be the exception, the rare and tragic situation where lethal force becomes unavoidable. But once governments begin publishing encounter scoreboards broken down by district, caste and religion, it starts looking like a method of policing, one that's measured, reported and politically marketed.
बहुत बार लोग टिप्पणी करते हैं कि पुलिस ने गोली क्यों मार दी। अगर पुलिस गोली ना मारी तो क्या पुलिस गोली खाए?
अगर किसी ने बदमाशी करने का प्रयास किया, किसी बेटी को छेड़ने का प्रयास किया, किसी की इज्जत पे हाथ डालने का प्रयास किया या कहीं चोरी डकैती करने का प्रयास किया, तो अगले चौराहे पे जाते जाते पुलिस उसको स्वयं दबोच देगी, भाग नहीं पाएगा। वो भाग नहीं पाएगा। एक जगह से सब कुछ वहीं से उसको पता ही नहीं लगेगा, लेकिन अगले चौराहे पर इससे पहले कि कुछ हो तब तक राम नाम सत्य है की बात सामने आ जाएगी।
Now, I also want to acknowledge the other side of this debate because Satpal's case demands that we do. India's courts are overwhelmed. There are tens of millions of pending cases. Criminal trials often take years, sometimes more than a decade to conclude. For the families of those victims, waiting another decade for justice probably does not feel like justice at all. It feels like another failure. But frustrations with the courts cannot become a substitute for the courts because Satpal can never tell us his version of events. He is dead. In Bihar, the only surviving witness to the fatal shooting are the officers who fired the shots. The difference is simply this: one dead man appears easier to condemn than the other, and that charges how willing we are to question the process itself. That is not how justice is supposed to work. Article 21 of the Indian Constitution is very, very clear. No person shall be deprived of life except according to procedures established by the law. What we are increasingly seeing in Uttar Pradesh resembles the crime control model pushed to its logical extreme. When courts move too slowly, policing begins to replace adjudication. The verdict is delivered before the trial ever begins. And perhaps the most uncomfortable part of all this is that none of it is hidden. It's happening openly with official statistics, with public celebrations, with governments proudly showcasing encounter numbers as evidence of success. But a process that appears reliable only because the person who dies seems guilty is not due process. It's simply a process we have stopped questioning because often enough we happen to like the result. Now let's come to the third story. At first glance, this one completely seems unrelated to everything that we have discussed so far. We are no longer talking about passports. We are no longer talking about police encounters. Instead, we are talking about one of the most important religious institutions in contemporary India, the Ram Temple in Ayodhya. But once again, beneath the surface, It's a story about institutions, accountability, and what happens when systems don't work the way they're supposed to. According to the investigation, there were close to 70 separate incidents of employees allegedly stealing cash from the donation counting process. That's almost 2 incidents every single day during the period under investigation. So far, 8 people have been arrested. Investigators say the alleged mastermind was a man known as Tinnu Yadav. Only 2 of the 8 arrested were direct employees of the Temple Trust. The other 6 worked for the State Bank of India, which assists in counting the temple donations. In other words, this wasn't simply an internal disciplinary problem. It crossed institutional boundaries. The people involved allegedly knew exactly where every visible CCTV camera was located. They understood the blind spots. It appears to have been carefully planned. What they didn't know was that there was another camera, a hidden one, installed quietly into the same room, and in the end, it was that concealed camera, not the official surveillance system everyone knew about, that exposed what had allegedly been happening for weeks. Now let's talk about leadership. Champat Rai, the General Secretary of the Ram Janmabhoomi Teerth Kshetra Trust, and for years one of the most recognizable public figures of the Ram Temple movement, resigned on Friday. According to the report, he delegated day-to-day responsibility for surveillance and donation counting to officials beneath him instead of personally overseeing those sensitive functions. So this is not really a story about one individual stealing money. It is about building a system that gradually stopped policing itself, a system that over time became vulnerable because those responsible for overseeing it were not looking closely enough or failed to act when warning signs appeared. To understand why this matters beyond this particular case, I want to introduce another thinker, the German sociologist Max Weber. Weber spent quite part of his career asking a fascinating question: how does a movement built around extraordinary people continue once it has become an ordinary institution? He described what he called charismatic authority. This is authority that comes from individuals, their personality, their sacrifice, the faith people place in them, their symbolic importance. But Weber also warned that charisma has limits. Charisma cannot manage payrolls. It cannot balance accounts. It cannot supervise financial system day after day. Eventually, every successful movement reaches a point where inspirations alone is no longer enough. It needs procedures, rules, professional management, independent oversight, audits. Weber called this transformation the routinization of charisma. And in many ways, the Ram Temple is almost a textbook example of that transition. For decades, it wasn't simply a temple project. It was a movement, a cause, a political and a religious mobilization that drew authority from belief, symbolism, and long years of activism. Champat Rai became one of its central figures because people trusted him, not because he was a financial administrator, not because he was an auditor, but because he had been there through the movement's defining moments. That kind of authority works remarkably well when you are building a movement. But once the temple was completed and opened to millions of devotees, everything changed. What the SIT report appears to describe is an institution where that transition was never fully completed. Sensitive financial responsibilities were allegedly assigned through relationships built during the movement years, through trust, recommendation, and personal loyalty rather than rigorous professional scrutiny. Which brings us back to that hidden camera. Think about what it represents. The visible cameras failed, the official safeguards failed, the assigned supervisors failed, the hidden camera became the only mechanism that actually held anyone accountable. And it worked precisely because nobody knew it existed.